They laughed at her the first time they saw the apples. It was a Tuesday morning in late June, the kind of morning that makes a man feel generous toward the world, when the sky is wide and blue and the air smells like pine sap and possibility. The men of Coldwater Bluff were gathered outside Harding's General Store, as they were most mornings, drinking coffee from tin cups and talking about nothing in particular. Someone mentioned the supply wagon coming over the pass next week. Someone else said the summer corn was looking strong. And then Garrett Finch squinted up at the ridge and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Will you look at that?" Up on the high ground where the tree line thinned and a lone cabin clung to the slope like a barnacle on a ship hull, Eleanor Graves was laying apple slices across a canvas tarp. One by one, methodical and unhurried, her figure, small against the sky, but her movements unmistakable. Around her, wooden rack stood between the trees, already hung with strips of something dark and salted. Twine lines stretched from post to post. Even from that distance, you could see she had been at it since before sunrise. Garrett laughed first. It was a big laugh, the kind that filled a room even when there was no room to fill, just open mountain air and pine trees. "That woman's lost her mind," he said, and the others smiled, because when Garrett said a thing with that much confidence, it was easy to agree. They were wrong, of course. But that is the thing about being wrong when the sun is shining and your belly is full. It feels exactly like being right. Eleanor Graves was 42 years old that summer. Her hair had gone gray at the temples, though she had never once thought to hide it. Her hands were rough and scarred from work that most men in the valley avoided, and she moved through the world with a directness that made people uncomfortable. The way a straight road in hill country makes people uncomfortable, because it suggests the person who made it knew exactly where they were going and did not care what you thought about the route. She had lived alone on that ridge for 4 years. Before that, she had lived there with her husband Thomas and their two boys Henry and James. Thomas had been a quiet man with a carpenter's hands, in a patience that Eleanor had loved without ever quite being able to explain. Henry had been 5, James 7, and both of them had their father's patience and their mother's stubbornness, which is a combination that produces either very capable people or very difficult ones, and in their case had been producing something that looked like both. Then came the winter of 1883. The story of that winter did not begin with snow. It began on a clear December night when the sky was calm and the air was still, and there was no reason at all to believe that by morning 3 feet of snow would bury the cabins of Coldwater Bluff, and by evening 5, and that it would not stop for 3 weeks. Eleanor had been the last one standing at the end of it, not because she was the strongest, not because she had done everything right, but because when Thomas went out on the 12th day to reach the woodpile, thinking the wind had died enough, he came back half frozen, his boots stiff with ice, and he never fully recovered. They burned the furniture after that, the chairs first, then the table Thomas had built with his own hands, then the bookshelf that held her small collection of poetry. By the time the oats ran out, Eleanor had been telling her boys she was not hungry for 4 days. Thomas died first. He gripped her hand and told her to save the boys. She tried. Henry went next. 5 years old, quiet in his sleep, his face finally warm after days of cold. James lasted 1 more day. 7 years old, brave enough to apologize for not being able to protect his brother. Eleanor held him and told him there was nothing to protect against, that he had been perfect, that she was proud of him in ways she could not find words for. She kept talking even after his breathing stopped, because she did not know what else to do. When the snow finally melted enough to open the door, she dug 3 graves in frozen ground. Not with a shovel. The shovel was somewhere under 4 feet of snow she could not move. She dug with her bare hands, her fingers cracking and bleeding against the earth. And when she was done, she stood over those 3 mounds and made a promise to the mountains that ring the valley like silent witnesses. Winter would never take another soul from her again. That promise is what the men outside Harding's General Store did not know about. They saw a woman drying apples on a roof in June, and they called it madness. They did not see what was underneath it. They did not see the 4 years of calculation and discipline and grief that had turned one terrible winter into a blueprint for survival. They saw the apples. They laughed, and Eleanor Graves did not look up once. Inside her cabin, on the small table beside the window, she kept a notebook. Not a diary. She had no use for diaries, for the indulgence of writing down feelings when feelings did not help you survive. The notebook was figures: pounds of salt, number of jars, days until first frost, days until the past became unreliable, days until a family of 4 with moderate activity would exhaust a given quantity of dried meat. The margins were dense with calculations crossed out and recalculated because Eleanor understood that being almost right was the same as being wrong when the stakes were this high. Tucked inside the front cover of that notebook was a single piece of paper that was not figures. It was a marriage certificate, the ink faded to brown at the edges with Thomas Graves' signature at the bottom, in the careful handwriting of a man who had learned to read late in life and never took the ability for granted. Eleanor did not open that page, but she did not remove it either. Every morning when she picked up the notebook to begin her calculations, her thumb passed over the fold in the paper, and she continued. That was the whole of her grief by then, a fold and a piece of paper. Everything else had been converted into preparation. By July, her yard looked less like a homestead and more like a fortification. Wooden racks stood tall between the pines, covered in strips of salted venison that had gone dark in the mountain sun. Fish hung from the twine lines, their silver skins stiffening in the dry air. Bundles of thyme and sweet and rosemary hung thick beneath the porch roof, filling the air around the cabin with a smell that drifted down into town on the right wind. Red tomatoes sat in thin slices on wire screens. The salt she had purchased from Harding's store over the spring sat in a cool corner of the cabin in 40-pound sacks, more than anyone in the valley had ever bought, and at one time enough that Harding had made a joke of it, saying she was either building a mine or pickling the whole mountain. Eleanor had not smiled. She had paid for the salt and carried it up the ridge herself, 2 loads, because there was no one to help her carry it. Down in town, the laughter had a comfortable rhythm to it by midsummer. Garrett Finch told the story of the roof apples at the tavern twice a week, adding details each time, the way a good story always grows in the telling until it becomes more true than what actually happened. His wife Nora would sit in the back of the room and listen and not say anything. She never said anything when Garrett was performing. But every morning when Garrett was still asleep and the house was quiet, Nora Finch stood at the kitchen window and looked up at the ridge. She could not see Eleanor's cabin from that angle. She could only see the top of the slope and the sky above it. But she looked anyway for reasons she could not have explained if asked. She had the feeling, the persistent and slightly uncomfortable feeling, that the woman up there was doing something important, and that not understanding what it was reflected worse on Nora than on Eleanor. Nora kept that feeling to herself. There were a great many things Nora kept to herself. Doc Aldous Hale kept things to himself as well, though what he kept was heavier. He was 55, silver-haired, with the careful hands and careful eyes of a man who had spent decades learning to observe before speaking. He was the only doctor in Coldwater Bluff, which meant he had been present for most of the valley's worst moments. The fevers and the broken bones and the difficult births, the slow deaths and the sudden ones. He had learned to carry those moments without letting them show. The winter of 1883 was different. He had been in town when the snow began. He had watched it accumulate with the professional attention of a man cataloging symptoms. By the second day, he had known it was serious. By the 4th day, he had known it was dangerous. By the 7th day, when the snow was above the windowsills and the wind was making travel impossible, he had thought about the Graves family up on the ridge. He had thought about Eleanor with 3 people dependent on her and a cabin that had not been built for 3 weeks of siege. He had thought about going. He had not gone. Not because of the snow, though the snow was genuinely impassable by then. Because of something quieter and more shameful than the snow. He had been afraid that if he went and found them in the condition he suspected, he would not have the skill to save them. He had been afraid of being present for something he could not fix. So he had waited for the storm to break, telling himself that the delay was prudent, that there was nothing to be done, that the decision was made by weather and not by him. When the storm finally broke and he climbed the ridge, he found Eleanor standing in her yard over 3 fresh mounds of earth, her hands wrapped in cloth torn from her own dress. She had looked at him with eyes that did not accuse him and did not forgive him either, because they had moved past both of those responses to something quieter and more absolute. She had looked at him the way people look at a fact. Just a fact. This is how things are. He had lived with that look for 4 years. When the men outside Harding's store laughed at Eleanor Graves, Doc Hale did not laugh with them. He stood a little apart holding his coffee cup and looked at the smoke rising from her chimney and thought about the things he had not done and could not undo and said nothing. He was good at saying nothing. It was he had come to understand one of his worst qualities. The summer moved through its long, warm weeks, and Eleanor moved through her preparations, and the town moved through its comfortable rhythms, and everything felt stable in the way that things feel stable just before they change. Then in the second week of August, Judge Harlan Voss rode up to Eleanor's cabin. He came in the afternoon dressed in black, despite the heat on a gray horse that was too fine for the terrain, and picked its way up the rocky trail with an expression of aristocratic suffering. Voss was 58 years old with the groomed look of a man who had once been important in a larger place and had brought the habits of that importance with him when the larger place had decided it could get along without him. He had been a lawyer in Philadelphia before a case went badly wrong, the details of which were never entirely clear, and he had come to Coldwater Bluff 7 years ago and made himself into the closest thing the valley had to a judge, which was close enough in a place this remote. He looked at Eleanor's drying racks with an expression that was trying to be neutral and landing somewhere closer to contempt. Eleanor was at the far end of the yard checking the tension on a twine line, and she did not stop working when he arrived. She let him dismount, let him tie his horse, let him walk across her yard and stand 3 feet from her before she acknowledged him. "Mr. Voss," she said without looking up. "Mrs. Graves." He removed his hat. The gesture was courteous in form and condescending in execution, the kind of courtesy that is really a reminder of who has the power to be courteous and who has to be grateful for it. "I've come to make you an offer. You've made it before. I'm prepared to improve it." Eleanor straightened up and looked at him directly. She had that quality rare and slightly unnerving of looking at people as though she were reading something written on their face that they did not know was there. Voss had encountered it before and did not like it. "This land isn't for sale," she said. "A woman alone on a ridge like this." He said it gently, which made it worse. "It's not practical, Mrs. Graves. The winters here are hard. The isolation is considerable. I could offer you enough to purchase a comfortable place in town somewhere with neighbors with community. I have everything I need here." Voss smiled. It was a patient smile, the smile of a man who believed that patience and persistence were the same thing as being right. He reached inside his coat and produced a folded document, which he held out to her with 2 fingers, as though offering something distasteful but necessary. Eleanor looked at it without taking it. "You appear to have an outstanding tax obligation on this property," Voss said. 3 years of land tax unresolved. The county has certain remedies available in cases like this." Eleanor took the document. She unfolded it, read it once, and then walked to the cabin door and held it over the flame of the oil lamp that burned just inside the threshold. The paper caught immediately. She held it until the flame reached her fingers, then dropped what remained into the dirt. "I've paid my taxes," she said. "There's no record of payment. My record is that I'm still standing on this land." Voss watched the last of the document curl into ash. Something moved across his face, then something that was not the patient smile and not the condescension, something that looked for a moment like genuine recalibration. He looked from the ash to the drying racks to Eleanor, and what he saw in that sequence seemed to rearrange a calculation he had been running. He put his hat back on. "I'll be in touch, Mrs. Graves." "You know the way down," she said and went back to her twine line. Voss rode down the mountain without another word. But at the bottom of the trail, where it leveled out before rejoining the main road, he stopped his horse and looked back up at the ridge. What he was looking for, or what he found, was not visible from the road. He sat there for a long moment, then turned his horse and rode toward town. What Eleanor did not know, and what no one in Coldwater Bluff knew, was that Judge Harlan Voss had in his possession a survey report commissioned by a railroad exploration team in 1885, purchased for a significant sum from a surveyor's assistant named Brace, who had needed money badly enough to overlook his professional obligations. Brace, as was his habit with every transaction he conducted outside normal channels, had retained a copy of the commission paperwork in the county records office, a quiet form of self-protection that he had never needed to use until now. Voss did not know about that copy. It had not occurred to him to ask. The report described the geological conditions of the mountain range in methodical detail. On page 11, in language precise enough to be unmistakable, it described the western ridge of the valley as structurally compromised, the upper slope showing evidence of significant subsurface erosion, the risk of large-scale failure elevated sharply in conditions of prolonged heavy rainfall. Voss had read that report 3 times. He had then locked it in the strongbox beneath his office floor and said nothing to anyone. His plan was simple, and in the way of simple plans built on other people's suffering, quite elegant. When the slide came and the report suggested it would come within 5 years, the valley would be cut off. Properties would lose their value overnight. People who had nothing saved, no preparation, no alternative, would sell cheap. Voss had been systematically identifying which properties he wanted and at what price. And Eleanor's land was at the top of the list, because Eleanor's land sat above the valley's only reliable underground water source, the spring that fed the creek that fed the lower fields. Whoever owned that land in a dry summer owned the valley. He had not expected her to be preparing. The sight of those drying racks, the jars, the salt, the methodical industry of a woman who was behaving as though she knew exactly what was coming had rattled something in his calculations that he had not yet finished examining when he rode back into town. The summer continued its arc toward autumn, and the signs, if you knew how to read them, were everywhere. The swallows left 2 weeks early. Eleanor noticed on a Thursday morning, standing on her porch with her coffee, watching the sky, where they should have been, and finding it empty. She stood there for a while, counting the absence of birds, and then went inside and updated her notebook. The squirrels were frantic in a way that went beyond their ordinary autumn industry. They moved with a driven quality, a purposefulness bordering on desperation, covering ground faster than usual, burying more than usual, their small bodies carrying an urgency that was not about this year's winter, but about something worse than this year's winter. Eleanor had learned to read this from Thomas, who had learned it from his father, a man who had survived the killing winter of 1856 in Nebraska through a combination of preparation and the willingness to believe what the land was telling him. The knowledge had passed from fear to fear across generations, encoded not in books, but in the specific quality of attention that people who had nearly died pay to the world around them. Eleanor paid that attention now. She'd been paying it for 4 years. In late July, the wind shifted. It came down from the northern peaks with a chill that did not belong in summer, carrying with it the smell of altitude and ice and distance. Eleanor was splitting wood behind the cabin when she felt it, and she stopped with the axe raised and stood there, with her eyes closed for a moment, feeling the wind on her face. Then she split twice the wood she had planned to split that day. September brought rain. Not the gentle rain of late summer, the kind that softens the garden and makes the evenings comfortable. This was hard rain driving and cold coming in from the northwest in sheets that turned the mountain road to mud within a week. Wagon wheels sank and could not be pulled free. The weekly supply run from the trading post over the pass, a journey that in good weather took a morning, began taking 2 days, then 3. By the 3rd week of September, the pass was officially closed to heavy wagons until conditions improved. The men in town said conditions would improve. They always had before. Eleanor said nothing. She had stopped buying supplies in August. Everything she needed was already in the cabin. On the night of September 24th, Reverend Cass Whitmore was awake at midnight, sitting at the small desk in his study with a lamp burning and his Sunday sermon spread in front of him in an unsatisfactory state. He had been wrestling with the text for 2 hours, and the text was winning. He stood up to stretch and walked to the window that faced the main road, and what he saw there stopped him. A horse-drawn buggy moving through the rain without a lamp, moving fast the way things move when they do not want to be seen. Moving toward the mountain pass that everyone said was impassable for wagons, but that a single light buggy with a driver who was motivated enough could still navigate if the driver knew the road well enough and cared more about getting through than about comfort. The buggy belonged to Judge Harlan Voss. Whitmore knew the horse a distinctive gray even in the rain and the dark. He stood at the window and watched it disappear around the curve in the road, and he stood there for a long time after it was gone. He thought about what it meant that Voss was leaving the valley alone at midnight in a rainstorm without telling anyone. He thought about several explanations, some innocent, some not. He was not a man who jumped to conclusions. He was a man who believed in the charitable interpretation, in the possibility that people had reasons for their actions that were not visible from the outside. He went back to his desk. He did not mention what he had seen to anyone. The following night, the lightning came. It came in 2 great strikes close together, the kind of lightning that feels less like weather and more like a decision made by something vast and indifferent. The first strike hit somewhere high on the western ridge. The second hit lower, and then from beneath both strikes came a sound that Eleanor heard from inside her cabin, a sound that she described later to the few people she ever discussed it with as the mountain clearing its throat. She was on the porch before the echo died. She stood in the rain and watched the western ridge move in a way that ridges do not move, watched the darkness shift and slide, watched trees that had stood for a century snap like kindling, watched boulders that had held their positions since before anyone now living was born, roll and tumble and carry everything below them down into the valley floor. The sound was immense and grinding and seemed to last much longer than it actually did. When it was over, the road was gone. Not damaged, not flooded, gone. Buried under a wall of earth and stone and shattered timber that filled the narrow pass like a cork pushed into a bottle. Coldwater Bluff was not cut off by weather. It was sealed. Whatever was in the valley when that mountainside came down was all there was. No wagons, no supplies, no flour, no sugar, no salt beyond what was already on the shelves. No way out and no way in, not until the earth was moved, and moving that much earth would take equipment that was on the other side of it. Eleanor stood on her porch in the rain for a long time. Then she went inside, lit the lamp, opened her notebook, and began recalculating. In the morning, Coldwater Bluff woke to silence. The particular silence of a place that has had something taken from it without warning, where the ordinary sounds of commerce and connection are simply absent and the absence is loud. No wagon wheels on the road. No echo of voices from the past. Just the wind and the birds that had been smart enough to leave early and the creek running high and cold and indifferent. Garrett Finch stood outside his house and looked toward the past and understood in the slow and unwilling way that a man understands something that contradicts everything he has been confident about, that there would be no supply wagon this week, or next week, or for a very long time. Down the street, Doc Hale stood on the steps of his office and looked at the same block pass and thought about the Graves family, about the winter of 1883, and about the choices a man makes when he is afraid of being present for something he cannot fix. He had made the wrong choice 4 years ago. He was not yet sure what the right choice would look like now, but he had the strong sense that it would involve going up the mountain rather than waiting at the bottom of it, and that waiting for the right moment to make it was itself a version of the same mistake he had made before. Garrett Finch had gone back inside his house. His wife was at the kitchen window looking up at the ridge the same way she had been doing every morning since June. He had never asked her why. He had assumed it was some feminine variety of worry or curiosity and had not thought it worth exploring. Now he stood in his kitchen in the aftermath of a landslide and looked at his shelves and did an accounting that he had never honestly done before, and the number he arrived at was not what he had expected. He looked at Nora. She was still looking at the ridge. He did not say anything to her. He was not yet ready to say the thing that the accounting required him to say. Up on the ridge, Eleanor Graves sat at her table with her notebook open and the rows of sealed jars lined along the wall behind her, their contents glowing darkly in the lamplight, each one a decision made in summer and honored now in the cold. She looked at her figures. She looked at the jars. She looked at the figures again. For the first time in 4 years, she did not feel the cold weight of helplessness that had lived in her chest since the night she dug 3 graves in frozen ground. She felt something else, something she did not have a name for exactly. Not happiness, not relief, more like the particular steadiness of a person who prepared for a hard thing, and then the hard thing came and the preparation held. The steadiness of a promise kept. Winter was coming early. Not everyone in the valley was going to survive it. But that was not Eleanor Graves understood with a clarity that was neither cruel nor kind, but simply accurate, entirely her problem to solve. She had done what she could do. She had spent 4 years doing it. Now the season had arrived, and the accounts were settled, and what happened next would depend on whether the people in the valley below were willing to do what was necessary. She thought about Nora Finch at the kitchen window every morning, looking up at the ridge for reasons she could not name. She thought about Doc Hale standing apart from the laughing men holding his coffee and saying nothing. She thought about the families who had bought enough flour for 3 weeks and called it sufficient. She did not think about Harlan Voss because Voss was on the other side of a wall of earth and stone and was someone else's problem now, and Eleanor had always been particular about which problems were hers and which were not. She closed the notebook. She put more wood on the fire. Outside, the rain continued to fall on a valley that had just become an island, and Eleanor Graves, who had been preparing for exactly this, began the long work of surviving it. The first knock came 3 days after the mountain fell, not from the direction of town, from the trail above where the ridge narrowed and the pines grew close enough together that a person moving between them at night would leave no shadow. Eleanor was at her table when she heard it, the lamp burning low, her notebook open to a page of numbers she had been revising since sundown. Her hand was already moving toward the rifle before the second knock came. 3 taps, soft, almost apologetic. She stood to one side of the door when she opened it the way a person stands when they are not certain what they are opening the door to. What she found was a boy, 16 years old, thin in a way that went past lean into something structural, as though the last several months had not merely reduced him, but had begun to dismantle him. His coat hung from his shoulders with nothing underneath to give it shape. His face in the lamplight that spilled past Eleanor into the dark was hollow at the cheeks and bright at the eyes, with the specific brightness of someone running on nothing at all. He said one word, "Please." Eleanor looked at his hands. They were shaking, and not from cold alone. She recognized him. Owen Calloway, Edgar Calloway's boy. She knew the father's name the way everyone in a small valley knows everyone else's name, which is to say she knew the shape of the man's failures as well as his name. Edgar Calloway had gone to pieces after his wife died. 2 winters ago, gone to pieces in the slow and public way that some men do, where the disintegration becomes a kind of performance that the whole community is expected to witness and accommodate. Owen had been accommodating it for 2 years, which explained the structural thinness, the shaking hands, the single word at the door. Eleanor stepped aside. Owen crossed the threshold and collapsed before he made it 3 steps into the room. She did not call for help. There was no help to call. She dragged him to the rug in front of the stove by herself, got a blanket over him, and put water on to heat. She worked efficiently and without sentiment, the way she did everything, and when she was done, she sat in the chair across the room and watched him breathe. His color was bad. His breathing was shallow. She understood with the same methodical precision she applied to everything that another night outside would have finished him. When he woke, the fire had been built up and something was simmering on the stove, and the cabin was warm in a way he had apparently not experienced recently enough, because he lay still for a long moment, with his eyes open, doing nothing except existing in the warmth, as though he needed to confirm it was real before he trusted it. He looked around the cabin then. The shelves along the wall, the carefully labeled jars standing in their rows, the bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters like small brown clouds, the neat stacks of smoked meat on the lower shelf wrapped in cloth and precisely arranged. More food than he had seen in weeks, more food than most of the valley had seen since the slide. "You were close," Eleanor said from across the room. "Another night outside and you wouldn't have woken." She brought him broth in a wooden bowl and told him to drink slowly. He obeyed. Each sip moved through him visibly, some of the tension leaving his shoulders, his breathing deepening. "I'm not Charity," Eleanor said when the bowl was half empty. "If you stay, you work. Haul water, split wood, check the trap lines. No stealing. No telling anyone what's in this cabin. Not the count, not the location, not what's on these shelves." Owen looked up at her. "Yes, ma'am. If trouble comes, you stay behind me and follow my lead. You don't make decisions without me." "Yes, ma'am." "There's a cot in the back room. It was my son's." She said it the way she said everything, without decoration, without asking for anything in response. Owen did not offer anything in response. He finished the broth and he went to the back room, and that was how it began. Within 2 weeks, the knocking started from town. Not bold knocking. Soft knocking, the kind produced by cold hands that had been raised and lowered several times before finally making contact with the wood. Parents appeared at the cabin door in the early mornings. In the late evenings, their faces wearing the specific expression of people who have arrived at a position they did not expect to occupy and are not handling it gracefully. Behind them, always slightly behind them, their children. Small faces with large eyes watching Eleanor, the way children watch someone they have been told is frightening and are not entirely sure whether to believe it. Eleanor's rule was simple. Children came in, parents stayed outside. The condition was 1 load of firewood per day per child, delivered before noon. No wood, no food, no shelter. It was not a negotiation. It was not presented as a negotiation. Eleanor stated it once and did not repeat herself, and the parents who understood what the alternative was went home and came back with wood. By the end of the first week, there were 6 children in the cabin. By the middle of the second week, 11. By the end of October, 14 souls occupied a 2-room cabin that had been built for a family of 4, and Eleanor had reorganized every inch of available space with the efficiency of someone who had been a quartermaster in a previous life and a grieving mother in this one. The days took on a strict order. Meals were measured to the ounce and served without variation. The older children, those 10 and above, were assigned tasks before breakfast. Splitting kindling, hauling water from the creek before it froze over, checking the small traps Eleanor had set along the tree line for rabbits and squirrels. The younger children swept floors and stacked wood and stayed out of the way of the older ones, which was itself a kind of work. Owen became her second in command without either of them formally acknowledging the arrangement. He was good at anticipating problems, at seeing the thing that was about to go wrong before it went wrong, and at solving it quietly without turning it into an event. He was also good with the younger children in the way that people who have had a hard childhood sometimes are not sentimental about it, not performing affection, but matter of fact and steady in a way that children find more reassuring than softness. It was on a Tuesday morning, the second week of November, that Garrett Finch appeared at the door. He came without his wife and without his usual volume. The big laugh was absent. He stood on the porch in his coat with his hat in his hands and two children behind him, a boy of 8 and a girl of 6, and he looked at Eleanor with the expression of a man who has arrived at a reckoning he has been delaying for some time. He produced a leather pouch from his coat pocket and held it out. The weight and sound of it identified its contents before Eleanor saw them. "I'll pay whatever you're asking," he said. Eleanor looked at the pouch and then at him. "What do you think I'm going to do with coin in a valley that's sealed off from every merchant within 40 miles? Garrett had no answer for that. His jaw moved slightly, the way a man's jaw moves when a prepared argument encounters a reality it did not account for. "My children need a place," he said. "Everyone's children need a place. The condition is 1 load of firewood a day." Eleanor looked at the two small faces behind him, then back at Garrett. "You can leave them. Bring the wood by noon tomorrow." Garrett put the pouch back in his pocket. He looked at Eleanor with something complicated moving behind his eyes, something that was not quite anger and not quite gratitude and not quite shame, but contained elements of all three. Then he put his hand briefly on his son's shoulder, a gesture so quick it was almost not a gesture at all, and walked back down the trail. The next morning, Nora Finch came up the mountain alone. She was carrying a bundle of split wood under each arm, moving steadily up the rocky trail in boots that were not quite right for the terrain, her breath coming in white clouds in the cold air. She made 2 trips. Eleanor watched her from the porch without speaking. On the second trip, when Nora set the wood down in the stack beside the cabin wall and straightened up and turned around, the two women looked at each other for a moment. "The children are fine," Eleanor said. "The boy had a cough. It's better." Nora nodded. She did not leave. She stood there with her hands at her sides, and then she said something that Eleanor had not expected from anyone in the valley and would not forget. "Could I learn how to do this?" She said it quietly, looking at the racks and the organized stacks and the careful system of it all. Not asking to participate, not asking for credit or access, asking to learn. Eleanor looked at her for a long moment. Then she stepped back from the doorway. Nora came in. She sat at the table and said nothing, watching Eleanor work, and Eleanor did not explain what she was doing or why, she simply did it, and Nora watched with the focused attention of someone who understands that the lesson is in the observation. After an hour, Nora produced a small notebook from her coat pocket and began writing things down. Eleanor saw this and slowed her hands slightly, making the movements more deliberate. She did not perform for Nora, but she did not hide from her either, and that distinction, small as it was, represented something new in Eleanor's life on the ridge. It was for both of them the closest thing to an understanding that either of them was capable of in that particular season of their lives. Reverend Cass Whitmore came up the following week, and his visit was considerably less quiet. He arrived in the early afternoon with the bearing of a man who has prepared his argument and is confident in it, wearing his good coat despite the mud, which Eleanor noted as a form of communication. He asked after the children. He looked around the cabin with the careful look of a man who is assessing something while pretending to be merely observing. "The church has more space," he said. Eleanor was working at the table and did not stop. "The church doesn't have food. The community can contribute. People will share when called upon by their faith." "They weren't sharing before the slide," Eleanor said. 14 families had enough to last 3 weeks. Some of them had enough for 2. None of them called upon their faith to do anything about that gap before the mountain closed the road. Whitmore absorbed this without visible reaction, which was a skill he had developed over decades. A community should face its trials together, centralized, organized, not dependent on the charity of one individual. Eleanor put down the jar she was holding and looked at him. "I agree, a community should face its trials together. I've been saying that since June. The difference between us, Reverend, is that I said it while drying meat, and you said it while it was still possible to disagree with me and pay no price for being wrong." Whitmore held her gaze for a moment. Then he said more quietly, "The children would be visible to their parents. It would be better for morale. Morale doesn't change the count in my notebook. The children stay here because the food is here. When the food moves, the children can move with it." He left without the agreement he had come for. Eleanor watched him walk back down the trail and thought about the things she had seen on his face that he did not know was visible. The particular look of a man who is carrying a piece of information he has not yet decided what to do with. She had seen that look before. She knew its shape. She filed it away and went back to work. 2 days later, Doc Aldous Hale came up the mountain, and his arrival was different from either Garrett's or Whitmore's in a way that Eleanor recognized before he opened his mouth. He came because Clara was sick. Clara was 7 years old, brown-haired, with a serious face that she had apparently been born with and had never seen a reason to change. She had been in the cabin for 3 weeks and had become in that time a small fixed point in the daily order of things, reliable and precise in her tasks and observant in a way that Eleanor respected. On the 4th day of November, she began coughing with the deep, rattling quality that in wintertime carries a weight of implication. Owen had gone down for the doctor without being asked. Eleanor noted this as evidence that the boy's judgment was developing in the right direction. Doc Hale came up through light snow, his bag in hand, his breath condensing in the cold air. Eleanor let him in without ceremony. He examined Clara with careful hands and a thorough attention that Eleanor watched with the eyes of someone evaluating competence. And when he was done, he straightened up and said, it was bronchial, not deep in the lungs, manageable with warmth and rest in the right herbs which Eleanor already had. He looked around the cabin then. He had not been inside since before the winter of 1883. You can stay, Eleanor said. It was not an invitation, it was a calculation stated aloud. There will be more children who get sick before spring. Doc Hale set his bag down on the table. He looked at it for a moment, then looked at Eleanor. I should have come up in 1883, he said, before the storm broke. You couldn't have made it through that snow. I know that. I also know I decided that before I tried. He paused. I was afraid I wouldn't be able to save them, so I waited for conditions that would justify not going. That's a different thing. Eleanor looked at him for a long time. She picked up her notebook. She set it down again. Then she said, there's a cot in the front room. I'll need it back when the child requires it. Doc Hale stayed. That night, after the children were asleep and the fire had been banked, and Owen was drowsing in the chair by the door with the rifle across his knees, Doc Hale sat across the table from Eleanor and told her about the map. He spoke quietly. He said that in the week before the slide, he had been at Harding's store when Voss came in to collect a package that had been held for him, a rolled document in a protective tube, the kind used for survey maps and architectural drawings. He had seen the exchange clearly. The man who delivered it was Brace, a surveyor's assistant, who worked out of the county seat and who had the look of someone being paid more than he was comfortable, being paid for something he was not comfortable delivering. Voss had taken the tube and left immediately. He had not opened it in the store. Eleanor listened without interrupting. When Doc Hale finished, she sat with the information for a moment, in the way she sat with calculations, examining it for what it confirmed and what it changed. Keep that, she said. Don't tell anyone else yet. What are you waiting for? A second piece. She looked at the fire. One man's account of a map tube is a starting point. 2 independent pieces pointing at the same thing is something a room full of frightened people can hold on to. She paused. And I want whoever provides that second piece to choose to provide it, not be forced. Doc Hale looked at her steadily. You think you know who has it? I think I saw it on Whitmore's face today. She picked up her pencil. We wait. He went to sleep on the cot in the front room, and Eleanor returned to her figures, and outside the snow came down on a valley that did not yet know how much it was about to need the patience of one woman who understood that timing was its own form of preparation. January came in cold and white and merciless. The temperature dropped to levels that made outdoor work genuinely dangerous, and Eleanor's schedule tightened accordingly. Trap checks were shortened. Water hauls were doubled up to reduce time outside. The children slept in 2 layers, and Eleanor moved through the cabin at night, checking that no one had kicked their covers off. The fog arrived on the 12th of January. It was the kind of fog that forms when extreme cold meets open water, dense and white, and absolute, reducing visibility to the length of a man's arm. It rolled through the valley and up the ridge and settled over the trees in a silence that had weight to it. Sound carried strangely in that fog, sometimes swallowed completely, sometimes arriving from the wrong direction at the wrong volume. Eleanor had warned Owen about the fog. She had told him to stay on the known trail and not to move faster than he could see. She had told him that conditions like this changed the risk of everything. Owen had been checking the fish traps at the frozen creek for 2 weeks without incident. He knew the trail. He took Colton Hayes with him because Colton was 9 years old and had cabin fever badly enough that Eleanor had decided the risk of leaving him inside unsupervised was comparable to the risk of taking him outside supervised, and Eleanor's calculations on comparative risk were rarely wrong. Eleanor was at the table with her notebook when she heard it. A single shot from the direction of the creek. The sound moved through the fog in a way that made it impossible to locate, precisely arriving as a flat crack that seemed to come from everywhere at once. She was on her feet before the echo finished. She reached the door and stopped herself from going through it, because going through the door into that fog without knowing what was out there was how you became the second casualty instead of the first response. She waited. She counted heartbeats. She had become very good at counting heartbeats in the years since 1883. 14 beats, then the sound of running on frozen ground. Owen came out of the fog carrying Colton Hayes the way you carry someone who can no longer carry themselves, the boy's weight against his chest, Owen's face white above the dark collar of his coat, his eyes finding Eleanor on the porch with an expression that she recognized from the worst night of her life. She came off the porch and took the boy from him. Colton was alive. The shot had caught him high on the left side, and the wound was serious, in the way that wounds in that location are serious, touching things that should not be touched, and Eleanor knew from the quality of the bleeding and the specific way Colton's breathing had changed that the injury was beyond what could be addressed with what she had on hand. Doc Hale was beside her within seconds. He had heard the shot, too. He worked over the boy for a long time, his hands moving with the focus and precision of a man applying everything he had, and Eleanor stood 3 feet back and did not interfere and did not look away. The children had been moved to the back room by Owen, who had understood without being told that this was not something the younger ones needed to see. Colton died before the hour was out. He died quietly, which was not a comfort, but was at least the truth. He did not suffer beyond the first minutes. Doc Hale sat back and was still for a moment, and then he covered the boy and stood up, and his face had the look of a man recataloging his own limitations in real time. Eleanor took Colton from the floor. She carried him to the back room herself, set him down gently, and stood there for a moment with her hand on his forehead. Then she went to find Owen. He was on the back step sitting in the snow, with his elbows on his knees, not wearing a coat. She brought the coat out and put it across his shoulders without saying anything, and then she sat beside him on the step. "I couldn't see where the shot came from," Owen said. "I know. I had him, and then Owen stopped. His hands were pressed flat against his thighs, pressing hard. "This is not your fault," Eleanor said. Owen looked at her. He was a boy who had spent 2 years absorbing blame for things that were not his doing, and the directness of those 4 words landed in him like something physical. "I knew one of them," he said after a moment. Eleanor waited. "Raymond Croft, he and his brother Silas. I saw Raymond's face in the fog before I ran. He used to bring firewood to our place when my mother was sick. He'd leave it on the step without knocking." The silence between them had a specific quality. Not empty. Full of the thing that neither of them had said yet. "Does that make him a bad man?" Owen asked. "It makes him a desperate one," Eleanor said. "What happened to Colton doesn't change because of what Raymond Croft used to be. But it also doesn't make him the same man he used to be. People aren't fixed points, Owen. Hunger moves them." Owen absorbed this. "Then what do we do now?" Eleanor stood up from the step. "Now we make it harder for it to happen again, and you learn to shoot without hesitating." She did not say that as a rebuke. She said it as a fact, which was worse and better at the same time. The next day, she set steel traps in a perimeter around the cabin, buried beneath thin layers of snow. Spaced at intervals she calculated would catch movement from any approach angle except the main trail. She reinforced the windows with additional planking, leaving narrow gaps for observation. She drilled Owen every morning at first light, dry firing at marks on the far tree until his hands were steady, regardless of what he was feeling. Owen did not argue about any of it. He had looked at Colton's face in the fog and made a decision that could not be unmade. The decision was visible in the changed quality of his attention, the way he now checked the sight lines before stepping outside, the way he positioned himself at the window, rather than the door when sounds came from the trees. Eleanor watched this change and said nothing about it. She simply adjusted her own positioning to account for his. They buried Colton behind the cabin in the ground that Eleanor and Owen broke together, working in shifts with the pickaxe because the earth had frozen to a depth that made it resistant rather than impossible. It took most of a day. The grave was beside 3 others, small mounds that had been there 4 years and had settled into the land with the permanence of things that are not going to be moved. Four graves now behind Eleanor Graves' cabin. The night after the burial, Eleanor sat alone by the fire long after everyone else was asleep. She had made a promise to the mountains 4 years ago. She had kept it imperfectly, which was the only way any promise could ever be kept, and Colton Hayes was in the ground outside, and that fact would not change. But this time Winter had not acted alone. She knew the names Silas and Raymond Croft. She knew roughly where they had been camping based on the direction of the shot and the terrain. She also knew that going after them directly was not the answer. Two desperate men in winter wilderness were dangerous in proportion to how cornered they felt. The answer was not pursuit. The answer was the same as it always was. Make the cabin harder to attack, strengthen what could be strengthened, and wait for hunger and cold to make different choices available. She opened her notebook. She turned to a fresh page. She drew a diagram of the cabin's approaches, the trees, the trail, the creek, the ground she had covered with traps, and the ground she had not. She was still working when the fire burned low. The days that followed Colton's burial had a different quality than the days before it. The cabin was the same. The routines were the same. The children did their work and ate their measured portions and slept in their layers. But something had shifted in the space between people. A new wariness, a new understanding of what the winter outside the walls was actually capable of that changed the way everyone moved and spoke and listened. Clara, who had been steady through everything, was quieter for a week after the burial. She still did her work, still answered when spoken to, still shelled her beans with the same methodical care. But she watched the windows more than she had before. Eleanor noticed this and did not comment on it because noticing was enough, and because some adjustments in a child's understanding of the world are necessary and cannot be softened without also being falsified. Owen was different in a way that was harder to name. He was more capable visibly in the specific ways that Eleanor had been working to develop. His hands were steadier. His judgment at the trap lines was better. He checked the sight lines before going outside with the automatic quality of a habit that has become reflex. But underneath the capability was something that had not been there before January. A particular kind of attentiveness that Eleanor recognized because she had developed the same thing herself after 1883. The attentiveness of a person who has learned that safety is not a condition, but a continuous effort, that it must be maintained by work and cannot be assumed by hope. She did not tell him this. She did not need to. He was learning it from the inside, which is the only way it can be learned. The traps around the cabin caught nothing human in the 2 weeks between the burial and the attack, but they caught enough rabbits and one small deer to supplement the dwindling stores in a way that Eleanor recorded carefully and was grateful for without being relieved by, because gratitude and relief are different things, and she had learned not to confuse them. Outside, the fog had lifted, and the stars over Coldwater Bluff were brutally clear the way they get in deep winter when there is no moisture left in the air to soften them. 14 children slept in a cabin that smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs and the close warmth of too many people in too small a space, which is actually the smell of survival of bodies generating heat against the cold of lives continuing against every reasonable expectation. 3 nights later, the smokehouse burned. Eleanor heard it before she saw it, the specific sound of fire that has been started deliberately rather than accidentally, the too fast catching of kerosene-fed flame. She was at the window in 2 steps. Orange light moved across the snow, casting shifting shadows among the trees, and in those shadows at the edge of the firelight's reach, dark shapes moved with the specific purpose of people who are waiting for something to drive their target into the open. "They want us outside," Owen said. He was already at her shoulder, already seeing what she was seeing. "We stay in." The first shot came through the east window, high, taking out a section of shutter. The second came through the front wall, splintering wood at head height. In the back room, children cried out, and Eleanor heard the older ones moving, heard Clara's voice steady and high, telling the younger children to get down and stay down, and felt something shift in her chest at the sound of a 7-year-old applying the protocols she had learned in this cabin. Eleanor counted the muzzle flashes. 2 shooters, one at the tree line, one at the woodpile they had not approached since the traps went in. She fired once through the east window. A sound came back through the dark that was not the sound of a miss. Owen fired twice through the rear wall at the angle they had identified during drills as the secondary approach. After the second shot, the movement at the woodpile stopped. They held position for 20 minutes after the last incoming shot. Then silence. When Eleanor finally stepped onto the porch, the smokehouse was ash. Weeks of smoked and preserved meat gone. The smell of it, that particular smell of good food destroyed, hung over the cabin in a way that was worse than the cold. She stood in front of it and did not move for a long time. Owen came out behind her. He stood there and did not speak. He had learned over 4 months when she needed the silence. But then he saw her hands at her sides, the way they were pressed into fists, not in anger but in the effort of containment. The slight movement in her shoulders that in another person, in a lesser practiced person, would have been the beginning of something that broke the surface. He understood in that moment that the stillness Eleanor carried was not the absence of feeling. It was the management of feeling performed consistently and at enormous cost, and seeing the cost made the stillness more impressive and more heartbreaking at the same time. It lasted only a moment. Then she turned and went inside. "We count what's left," she said. Owen followed her in. Later that night, when the children were settled again, and Doc Hale had confirmed that no one had been hit, and Clara's cough had not worsened from the cold air she had breathed during the attack, Eleanor sat at her table with her notebook. She did the calculation 3 times because the first 2 times she hoped she had made an error. She had not. The smokehouse had contained 40% of their remaining meat supply. The jars on the shelves, the dried goods, the careful stores she had been managing to the ounce for 4 months were now balanced on an edge so narrow that a single miscalculation would mean choosing who ate and who did not. 7 weeks until the ground softened enough to plant. Eleanor looked at the number she had written at the bottom of the page. She had spent 4 years ensuring that she would never sit in front of a number like that again. She looked at it for a long time. Then she drew a line under it and began calculating what it would take to survive it. The morning after the smokehouse burned, Eleanor reduced the rations before anyone asked her to. She stood at the table with the notebook open and called the older children together, first the ones 10, and above the ones she had been using as her secondary structure inside the cabin. She showed them the numbers, not simplified, not softened. The actual numbers in her actual handwriting, the columns of figures that represented the distance between where they were and where they needed to get to. Then she showed them the new column on the right side of the page. "This is what each person eats starting today," she said. "No second servings, no extra bread, not until the first green comes out of the ground." None of them argued. They had watched Owen and Eleanor carry Colton Hayes to his grave in the frozen earth. They understood what the alternative to difficult numbers looked like. Owen posted the new schedule on the wall beside the stove. He did it without being asked, using a nail and a strip of cloth, and when the younger children came in and saw it and started to ask questions, he answered them in the straightforward way. Eleanor had modeled without drama and without false comfort. Eleanor watched this from across the room and felt something she recognized only because she had felt its absence for so long. Something adjacent to pride. She returned to her notebook. 7 weeks. If the weather held, if no one got seriously sick, if nothing else was taken from them. She did not write this word if. She wrote the number 7 and circled it and worked backward from there. On the 5th day of February, Raymond Croft knocked on the cabin door alone. Owen opened it with the rifle in his hands because that was the protocol, and Owen followed protocols now with the thoroughness of someone who understood why they existed. He found Raymond standing in the snow, with both hands raised to shoulder height, palms forward, the posture of a man who has decided that arriving without a threat is the only currency he has left. Raymond was gaunt in a way that reordered his face. The man Owen remembered, the one who had left firewood on the step without knocking in the year his mother died, had been a solid man, broad-shouldered with the kind of presence that occupies space. What stood in the snow now occupied considerably less. Hunger had not merely reduced him, it had revised him into something harder to look at because it was closer to the bone of who he actually was. "I'm not here for food," Raymond said. Owen kept the rifle level. "Then what?" "I'm here because I'm the one who fired the shot in the fog." The admission landed in the cold air between them and stayed there. Eleanor appeared behind Owen's shoulder. She had heard the knock and came through the front room with the specific quality of movement she had developed over 4 months of responding to things at a speed that did not betray urgency. She looked at Raymond Croft and said nothing for a long moment. "Your boy," she said finally. "Where is he?" Raymond blinked. He had not expected that to be the first question. "In the tree line. He's cold." "Bring him in." Raymond turned and called out, and a child appeared from between the pines. Small, 7 or 8, moving through the snow with the careful steps of someone whose feet hurt. Eleanor watched the child come across the yard and held the door. Raymond and his son came inside. Eleanor put the child by the stove and gave him something warm to drink, and did not speak to Raymond directly while she did it, which was its own kind of communication. When the boy's color had improved and his shaking had settled, she pulled a chair to the table and sat down and looked at Raymond. Silas told you to fire, she said, not a question. He told me to fire above them, to scare them off the trap line so we could take the catch. Raymond looked at his hands. I couldn't see well in the fog. I didn't know there was a boy until Owen was running. And after I couldn't sleep. He said it simply without drama, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than an elaborate confession would have. Silas said it was an accident, and accidents happen when people are starving, and I should put it behind me. I couldn't. Owen stood against the far wall through all of this, the rifle lowered, but still in his hands. His face was doing something complicated that Eleanor did not comment on. You can stay, Eleanor said. Your boy stays. You work same as everyone else. The conditions are the same as they've always been. She looked at him steadily. What happened to Colton Hayes doesn't go away because you're inside instead of outside. You understand that? Yes. You'll answer for it properly when the pass opens, and there's a way to answer for it properly. I'm not a court. I know. Good. She stood up. There's a section of wall on the north side that needs rebanking before the next cold snap. Owen will show you. Raymond Croft bent his head. When he raised it again, his eyes were wet, and he did not apologize for that. He simply stood up and followed Owen outside. That night, Owen sat down across from Eleanor after the others were asleep. He did not ask a question. He simply said, I thought I wouldn't be able to look at him. And man, I can. It's harder than I expected and easier than I feared. Eleanor looked at him for a moment. That's most things, she said. Silas Croft came 6 nights later. He came after dark, and he came angry, and he announced himself not by knocking, but by hitting the door with the flat of his hand hard enough to rattle the latch. Owen was up before the sound finished, the rifle in position, moving to the window beside the door, rather than the door itself the way Eleanor had drilled him. Raymond! Silas's voice through the door was rough and loud. Raymond, I know you're in there. Come out. Eleanor was behind Owen, fully dressed. She had not been fully asleep. She rarely was anymore. She put her hand briefly on Owen's arm, a signal that meant wait, and then she opened the door herself. Silas Croft was not as reduced as his brother. He had made different choices about what to spend his resources on, and one of those choices was standing upright and presenting himself as a threat, which requires a certain baseline of physical maintenance. He had a rifle slung over his shoulder, and he looked at Eleanor with the expression of a man who has decided on confrontation without thinking through what it would cost him. His eyes moved past her to the interior of the cabin and found Owen at the window with the rifle aimed at the center of his chest. My brother, Silas said, is staying, Eleanor replied. His son is staying. That's not a discussion. I'm his family. You told him an accident was an accident when you both knew it wasn't. That's a particular kind of family. She said it without heat. You can come in, or you can go back in wherever you have been. If you come in, the conditions are the same as they are for everyone else. If you try to take your brother out of here by force, Owen is going to shoot you, and I'm going to let him, and we're going to add another grave to the row behind this cabin. The silence that followed had a physical quality, the kind that occurs when a man is genuinely recalculating whether the position he is committed to is worth the cost of maintaining it. Silas looked past Eleanor at the interior of the cabin, the warmth visible even from outside, the light, the small shape of his nephew asleep on a cot near the stove. He stood there long enough that his breath started to come in the shallow, rapid way that means the body is making decisions the mind hasn't caught up with yet. He looked at Eleanor. One bowl, she said. You eat and you sleep, and tomorrow you work. That's the offer. Silas Croft put the rifle in the snowstock first. He came inside. He ate in silence. He slept on the floor by the door with his coat for a blanket. In the morning, he was up before Owen and had already brought in a load of wood by the time Eleanor came out of the back room. She looked at the wood and then at him and said nothing, and he said nothing, and that was the beginning of an arrangement that was not forgiveness and was not trust, but was something more durable than either of those in the immediate term, which was usefulness. Raymond watched his brother from across the cabin that morning, and Eleanor watched Raymond watching him, and no one said anything about any of it because some things are better understood than spoken. 3 weeks later, Garrett Finch came up the mountain for the second time. He came alone without his wife, without the coin pouch, without the loud confidence that had been his primary mode of presenting himself to the world for as long as Eleanor had known him. He came with a small cloth bag that he held in front of him with both hands, a posture that on a man of Garrett's size looked almost ceremonial. Eleanor opened the door and waited. "Found these in the back of the mill," he said. He held out the bag. Dried beans by the weight and sound of it. 2 pounds, maybe a little more. I forgot I had them. "No, you didn't," Eleanor said. Garrett held her gaze. "No, I didn't." He paused. "I was keeping them in case." "In case of what?" "In case things got worse than they already were." He lowered the bag slightly. "I kept telling myself there would be a point where it made sense to share them, and I kept finding reasons why that point hadn't arrived yet." He looked at her steadily. "There's something else I need to tell you. Before the slide Voss came to see me, he had a document said it was a psychiatric assessment that you were unstable and a danger to yourself on that land. He wanted me to sign as a witness to behavior I had allegedly observed." Eleanor's expression did not change. "I signed it," Garrett said. "I told myself it didn't mean anything, that I was doing him a favor, that the woman on the ridge was none of my business." He stopped. "3 witnesses saw me sign it. They're all in the valley. The document is wherever Voss took it when he rode out that night." The silence between them had a different quality from the one between Eleanor and Silas. That silence had been about threat and calculation. This one was about something that had no clean resolution, and both of them knew it. Eleanor took the bag of beans. "Thank you," she said. 2 words even and direct, carrying exactly the weight she intended them to carry, which was not absolution, but was acknowledgement. And acknowledgement was what Garrett Finch needed more than anything else she could have offered. He stood on the porch for a moment longer. "My wife's been keeping a notebook," he said. "Everything she learned up here, she's been teaching the women in town, some of the men." He looked out at the valley, the white expanse of it, the sealed pass at its far end. "We should have been doing this 4 years ago." "Yes," Eleanor said, "you should have." She went inside. Garrett walked back down the mountain, and his shoulders, Eleanor noticed through the window, were set differently than when he had arrived. Not lighter exactly, straighter. The difference between a man carrying a weight and a man who has set it down in the right place. The community meeting happened on a Sunday in late February, convened at the church because it was the largest enclosed space in Coldwater Bluff, and because Reverend Whitmore had asked for it. Eleanor did not attend. She had 17 people and 4 months of discipline to maintain, and the management of that did not pause for meetings. Owen reported back to her afterwards, sitting at the table with a cup of the thin broth they were allowing themselves in the evenings, speaking in the straightforward way he had developed for conveying information he knew she needed. Whitmore had stood up in front of the assembled valley and spoken about the night he saw Voss leave. He had described the buggy, the rain, the absence of lights, the direction of travel. He had said the word that the room had been building toward for 4 months without quite arriving at it. He had said the name. And then he had said something that no one in that room had expected a reverend to say from the front of his own church. He had said that he had been wrong to stay silent, not mistaken. Wrong. He had used that word specifically, and the distinction, Owen said, was audible in how the room received it. People who had expected an explanation received a confession instead, and there is no good response to a genuine confession except silence, and the room gave him that. "What did people say after?" Eleanor asked. "They asked why he didn't say sooner." "What did he say?" "That he was afraid of being wrong, and that it was the worst reason he'd ever had for anything." Eleanor looked at her cup for a moment. She thought about what it cost a man of Whitmore's position to stand in his own church and say that to his own congregation. Not everything that came too late was worthless. Doc Hale had also spoken at the meeting, Owen said. He had described what he had seen at Harding's store, the exchange between Voss and Brace, the nature of the rolled document. He had explained that Brace, as a matter of professional habit, kept records of every transaction he conducted, and that a copy of the survey commission and sale existed in the county records office, independent of whatever Voss had carried away with him. The document Voss held was not the only copy. It had never been the only copy. And that fact, arriving in the room after 4 months of sealed roads and rationed food and one child buried in frozen ground, landed like something long owed. The meeting had ended without a formal resolution because there was no formal body to resolve anything, Voss having vacated the only position of authority in the valley the night he rode out in the rain. But something had shifted, Owen said. The way people sat next to each other, the way they spoke about the spring, the word "we" appearing in sentences where for 4 months the word "I" had been doing all the work. Was it enough? Eleanor asked. Owen considered this seriously, the way he considered serious questions, now taking the time the question deserved. "I think it was the beginning of enough," he said. That satisfied Eleanor. Beginnings were what she worked with. She had spent 4 years working with the beginning of a promise and building it into something that had kept 17 people alive through a sealed winter. The document situation resolved itself in the first week of April. A man named Willis made the initial crossing through the partially cleared pass on horseback, following a route that was passable only because the snow had begun its slow withdrawal from the lower sections of the slide. He carried with him a written account compiled by Doc Hale, Reverend Whitmore Garrett Finch, and two other witnesses describing the survey transaction, the timing of Voss's departure, and the chain of events that had followed. He also carried a formal request to the county records office to produce the original commission documentation from Brace's files. Eleanor did not write anything for that account. She was asked twice and declined twice. What she had done spoke well enough for itself, and she had never felt any particular need to narrate her own actions. Voss was located in the county seat where he had been waiting with the quiet patience of a man who believed he had positioned himself correctly and needed only to wait for the valley's distress to reach a sufficient level that his offers would be accepted. The discovery of the county records cross-referenced against the date of his purchase from Brace and the date of the slide produced consequences that were not immediate and not clean, but were in the end sufficient. His legal standing was stripped. His property holdings in the valley were contested. He did not return to Coldwater Bluff, and no one sent word asking him to. Eleanor learned of this through Doc Hale, who came up the mountain on a Wednesday in April specifically to tell her. She listened. She nodded. "Is that it?" Doc Hale asked, studying her face. "What else should there be?" "I don't know. Satisfaction, perhaps." Eleanor looked out at the yard where two of the older children were turning the first section of soil in the kitchen garden, their breath steaming in the April air, their movements carrying the specific energy of people who have been through something and are now on the other side of it. "I'm satisfied," she said. "I've been satisfied since the first green came up 3 weeks ago." Doc Hale looked at the garden. He had been present for that morning, the morning Eleanor had stepped outside at dawn and found the first pale shoots breaking the soil in the bed she had prepared against the south wall of the cabin. He had watched her kneel in the earth and press her fingers into the ground, and he had turned away to give her the privacy of the moment, and when he looked back, she was standing up again, and her face was composed. He had not turned away quickly enough to miss everything. He had seen her shoulders move with the single deep breath of someone releasing something that has been held for a very long time. He had seen enough to understand that the composure was what came after, not instead of. And he had filed that away with the other things he had learned that winter about the difference between strength and the performance of strength, and about which of the two was actually harder to sustain over time. That spring, Coldwater Bluff planted together. Not in coordination exactly, not with any central direction or organized plan, but the impulse moved through the valley the way warmth moves through a body, when circulation returns, not all at once, and not evenly, but unmistakably and in one direction. Families that had spent the winter locked inside their separate fears came out into the April mud and began turning soil, and when they looked up from their own plots, they found their neighbors doing the same thing, and the looking up became talking, and the talking became helping, and the helping became slowly and imperfectly the thing that Coldwater Bluff had been trying to become before it forgot to keep trying. Nora Finch, that first week of planting, walked to 4 different homesteads with her notebook, the one filled with Eleanor's methods in her careful handwriting. She sat at tables and showed people what she had learned, demonstrated techniques with the matter-of-fact assurance of a woman who has been practicing all winter and no longer needs to frame herself as a student. She did not say she had learned it from Eleanor. She did not need to. Everyone knew. Everyone knew, and no one said anything dismissive about it, which in Coldwater Bluff constituted a significant cultural shift, and which Eleanor, had she been told about, it would have considered a more meaningful tribute than any building named after her. What Nora was doing, though no one would have described it this way at the time, was translating. She had spent a winter learning a language, the language of preparation and measurement, and the patient accumulation of small advantages against large risks, and she was now carrying that language into houses where it had never been spoken, and speaking it in terms that the people in those houses could hear. She was good at this in a way that Eleanor was not because Eleanor's knowledge was inferior, but because Nora understood the particular reluctance of people who need to be taught, but do not want to appear as though they are being taught. She arrived at doors as a neighbor, sharing what she knew, not as a student, conveying what she had learned from someone they had laughed at, And the distinction mattered more than it should have, which is something Nora understood, and Eleanor did not need to understand because Nora was handling it. Garrett Finch rebuilt Eleanor's smokehouse in the second week of April. He brought 2 other men with him, and they built it in stone rather than wood using flat fieldstone from the creek bed, mortared and fitted with a precision that suggested Garrett had been planning this particular structure in his mind since at least February. He did not ask Eleanor if he could do it. He simply arrived with the materials and began. When it was done, he stood back and looked at it for a long moment without asking Eleanor what she thought. She came out and stood beside him and looked at it. "Stays cool in summer," she said, "better for the meat." "I know," Garrett said. He had thought about it carefully. He had wanted to build it right. He picked up his tools and went back down the mountain, and this time Eleanor did not watch him go. She was already thinking about what the new smokehouse would need for its first season and how much of the spring meat she could preserve before the summer heat changed the conditions, and what adjustments she needed to make to her schedule to account for having additional working hands whose labor had by now proved genuine, if not yet entirely predictable. Owen found the marriage certificate on a Tuesday morning tucked between 2 floorboards near the back of the cabin, where it had apparently migrated over the course of a winter of heavy use, worked loose from the notebook at some point during the long weeks of occupation, and settled into the gap without anyone noticing. He picked it up and looked at the brown ink of Thomas Graves's signature without reading anything else on the document, because he understood, without having to think about it, that this was not something he was meant to read. He put it on the table open to the signature page where Eleanor would see it when she came in. When she came in, she saw it. She stood at the table for a moment and looked at it without moving. Then she picked it up and opened the front cover of her notebook and placed it back inside, smoothing it once with her thumb, with the particular care of someone returning something to its rightful place after a long displacement. She did not say anything to Owen about it, but that evening when she was doing the figures for the spring planting, he noticed that she opened the notebook more slowly than usual. Not with hesitation, with intention. The difference between a person who opens a door and a person who opens a door and knows what is on the other side of it and is glad. That was the whole of it. It was enough. The supply wagon came through the cleared pass on the 14th of May. The driver's name was Alderman, a compact man of 50, with sun-damaged skin and the general disposition of someone who has seen a great deal of remote country and has calibrated his expectations accordingly. He had heard that Coldwater Bluff had been sealed since September. He had heard it from 2 different sources, both of whom had predicted casualties. He drove into town and found people in the street, not desperate people, not hollow-faced people pressing toward the wagon with the frantic need of communities that have been surviving rather than living. He found people who looked at the wagon with interest and not urgency, who greeted him normally, who directed him to Harding's store with the relaxed authority of people who have arrangements in hand. Garrett Finch was the first one to reach him. "We heard you were sealed all winter," Alderman said. "We were," Garrett said. "How did you manage?" Garrett looked up at the ridge. The answer was up there, visible, if you knew what you were looking at: the stone smokehouse, and the organized racks in the cabin that had held 17 people through the hardest winter in 20 years. He looked up for a long moment, long enough that Alderman turned and looked too, though he could not yet see what he was looking at. "Someone was ready," Garrett said. "Most of us weren't. We were lucky she didn't give up on us before we got our heads straight." Alderman looked up at the ridge. He couldn't see much from the road. He made a note to ask about it when he had time. The story he suspected was worth knowing. In his experience, the stories worth knowing were never the ones people led with. Eleanor came down from the ridge that afternoon, not for the supply wagon, but because she had 2 things to collect from Harding's store, and she preferred to do it before the crowd thinned and she had to explain herself to the people who wanted to thank her. She was not good at being thanked. She did not find it useful. She collected her items and was leaving when Doc Hale fell into step beside her. They walked together out of town and up the lower section of the trail before either of them spoke. Then Doc Hale said, "There's talk of naming the new community hall after you." "There's always talk," Eleanor said. "You could let them. It would mean something to people. I know what it would mean to them. That's why I won't allow it." Doc Hale thought about this, because it lets them resolve something that shouldn't be resolved yet. Eleanor stopped walking and looked at him. It was the look she gave people when they said something accurate. "Plant something that feeds people," she said. "Name it something practical, something that tells the next person who arrives here exactly what it's for." They stood at the fork where the trail split the lower branch going back to town, and the upper continuing to the ridge. Doc Hale would go back. He had a practice to reestablish patience, to see a community to serve with a different quality of attention he had acquired over a winter of being forced to be useful in ways that mattered. He was a better doctor than he had been in September. He was not sure he would have chosen the way he became a better doctor, but the result was what it was, and he intended to keep it. "Will you come down more?" he asked, "now that it's over?" "It's not over," Eleanor said. "It's just not winter." She went up the trail. He watched her go for a moment, the figure moving with its characteristic, purposeful directness. And then he turned and went back to town. There was work to do. There always was. That was, he had come to understand, not a burden, but a form of grace. And Eleanor Graves had spent 4 years trying to teach it to a valley that had not been ready to learn it until it had no other choice. Up on the ridge, Owen was in the kitchen garden when Eleanor came around the corner of the cabin. He had turned a second section that morning and was staking the rows with the precision she had taught him, giving each plant the space it needed and not more, because space in a kitchen garden, like resources in a difficult season, is something that only exists if someone thinks ahead to create it. Clara was sitting on the porch step, shelling dried beans into a bowl, her small fingers working with the steadiness she brought to all her tasks. She looked up when Eleanor came through the gate. "A man from town came up while you were gone," Clara said. "He left something." She pointed to the porch railing where a bundle of seedlings had been propped, roots wrapped in wet cloth, the leaves pale and new. Eleanor looked at the seedlings. She did not know who had left them. It did not particularly matter. What mattered was that someone had thought to bring something living to the ridge, rather than something useful, which meant the valley was far enough past mere survival to have room for gestures. That was its own kind of data point, and she noted it. She picked up the seedlings and carried them to the corner of the garden, where the soil was richest, where the south wall caught the afternoon sun and held it. She knelt and began preparing the ground, with her hands working the earth between her fingers, reading it for what it could sustain and what it still needed. Clara left the porch and came to stand at the garden edge. Owen at the far end did not look up from his staking, but he went still in the way of someone listening for an answer they also want to know. "Will winter come back?" Clara asked. "It always does," Eleanor said. Clara was quiet for a moment, then, "Will we be scared?" Eleanor pressed the first seedling into the earth, firmed the soil around it, moved to the next. The motion was practiced and sure. The motion of a woman who has been doing this particular thing for many years and will continue doing it for many more. She looked down the slope at the valley below where the new stone smokehouse threw a clean shadow across the yard, where drying racks stood ready outside half a dozen homes, where the mountain that had sealed them and tested them and very nearly broken them was still there, still enormous, still exactly itself. Unchanged, indifferent, patient. She looked at all of it for a long moment. Then she looked at Clara, who was waiting with the serious patience of a child who has learned that some questions deserve real answers. "No," Eleanor said. "We'll be ready." She went back to her planting. The afternoon light moved across the ridge in the slow way of spring light, warming the soil where it touched unhurried and sufficient. Owen finished his staking and began on a third row. Clara went back to her beans. The valley below moved through its ordinary afternoon sounds, the sounds of a place that had been through something and had come out the other side of it, changed in ways that would not be visible all at once, but would be visible over time in the depth of the root cellars and the weight of the stores and the willingness of neighbors to share what they knew before they were asked. On the far ridge where the western slope had failed and the rocks still showed raw, in the places where the earth had given way, green had already begun to return. Small and tentative, pushing up through the disturbed soil with the same unremarkable stubbornness that green things always demonstrate, indifferent to the scale of the disruption, interested only in the fact of the light. Eleanor did not look at it particularly. She had noted it 2 weeks ago and updated her notebook accordingly. The land was recovering. The land, in her experience, always recovered. The question was never whether the land would recover. The question was whether the people on it would be paying enough attention to recover with it. She had been paying attention for 4 years. She intended to continue. The seedlings went into the ground one by one, careful and deliberate, each one given what it needed to become the thing it was going to become. By the time the light shifted toward evening, the row was planted and staked and watered from the bucket Owen had filled at the creek. Eleanor stood up. She pressed her hands together once to knock the soil loose, looked at the row, and walked to the cabin. She opened the notebook on the table. She turned to the last page of calculations, the ones she had run and rerun through February and March, the numbers that had told her it was possible if nothing else went wrong, and everyone did their part, and the weather held, and the decisions were right. She drew a line under the final figure. On the next clean page, she wrote the date. Then she wrote a number that was not a survival calculation. It was a planting estimate, how much the garden would yield, how many jars it would fill, how much salt she would need, how many weeks of preparation she could complete before the first cold wind came down from the northern peaks again. It was June. She had the whole summer. She picked up her pencil and got to work. The summer came in full and warm, and the garden grew the way gardens grow when the soil has been properly prepared, and the person tending it knows what it needs before it needs it. Eleanor moved through her days with the same purposeful economy she had always used, but there was something in the rhythm of that summer that was different from the 4 summers before it, something she could not have precisely named and did not try to name. The preparation was the same, the work was the same, the notebook and its columns of figures were the same, but she was not doing it alone anymore. That was the difference. Not the company exactly, though. There was more of that now than there had been. Something subtler. The knowledge was moving outward through Nora's notebook and Garrett's stone smokehouse, and Doc Hale's open door, and Reverend Whitmore's honest sermon, and Eleanor could feel it moving the way you can feel a change in weather before the weather arrives in the pressure and the quality of the light. The valley was learning, late and at cost and still imperfectly, the way all genuine learning happens. But learning. By August, there were drying racks behind 6 houses in Coldwater Bluff that had not been there the previous summer. The root cellars were deeper. The salt orders at Harding's store were spread across a dozen families. Harding himself, the man who had made the joke about mining and pickling the whole mountain, quietly doubled his own stock in early July and said nothing to anyone about why. Eleanor noticed. She did not comment. Some reckonings are better honored by acceptance than by acknowledgement, and the valley was arriving slowly and at considerable cost. At the same understanding, she had spent 4 years reaching alone on a ridge, while the men below her laughed. The learning was worth the cost. It always was. She wrote the date at the top of the new page. She wrote the first number. Outside, the summer light lay long and gold across the ridge, and below the valley moved through its preparations, and for the first time in 4 years, Eleanor Graves did not feel entirely alone in hers.